90 to 92. The Gerry Ryan Show, Monday to Friday, 9 till 12 on 2FM.
All right. In the US, news has been buzzing with reports that a Canadian man has come forward claiming to be John Fitzgerald Kennedy's love child. Vanity Fair, the magazine, has been working on a story for a year and a half, and while they have tried to keep the lid on the story till they're ready to publish, little bits and pieces are now beginning to leak out. It's inevitable, it always happens. And to say that they're intriguing would be an understatement. We asked our man in America, John Farrell, a self-professed Kennedy conspiracy aficionado, and believe you me, he knows more than most. For more than 4 decades, this fella's been thinking Kennedy, to have a look at this story and see if he could pull together some of the clues. John Farrell, good morning.
Good morning, Gerry.
How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Good.
Good. Now, let's get the details. The guy's name is Jack Worthington Myers, a movie star's name if ever I heard one. What do we actually know about the guy?
Well, this is what's kind of troubling. We don't seem to know a great deal about him. Now, he's in Vancouver, in British Columbia, but he apparently only moved to Canada about 5 or 6 months ago. His wife is a Canadian citizen. And we also know that his stepfather also only passed away within the last year. So it seems as though he's been keeping this to himself until both his mother and his stepfather passed away, and possibly until he also got out of the country, which is kind of interesting and strange, that he went to as I say, moved to Vancouver. Now, the physical similarity between this chap and John Fitzgerald Kennedy is actually pretty striking, because he has the whole brow and the eyes, and the hair looks very similar as well. So that in itself is kind of a makes you take
I mean, is that a look-alike thing, John? Or when you look at the photographs, and they have taken some photographs of him, I gather, do you really see a likeness?
Well, what's interesting is that what he has said about his story is that his mother had been introduced to JFK shortly after the inauguration in '61, but had been introduced to him by Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Oh.
Now that adds a little something there. Was Johnson kind of saying, "Oh, Jack, here, have one of these beautiful Dallas girls," because both Lyndon Johnson and Jack Kennedy were known for their womanizing.
But Lyndon Baines Johnson would be, well, he'd be fairly up for that. He would have been fairly up for that. He'd be very much in agreement that Mr. Kennedy should enjoy this type of pleasure.
Sure. I mean, I think back then, when you're looking at 1960, politics was very much a male-dominated world, and almost entirely. And certainly the idea that the boys would go out and relax and get a few broads and have a few drinks was very much in character at the time. And it would seem to suggest that Johnson may have been trying to insinuate himself with Kennedy by saying, hey, I can help you out with this. Or could it have been something a little more sinister? Was Johnson trying to get leverage over Kennedy by because there's also a way with corruption and things like that if you're the person who aids or assists or colludes, then you have a certain kind of sway over the person you did the favor for. Wink, 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 wink.
Now, I gather if you look at the timeline, Lyndon Baines, if he was the guy who presented Mr. Kennedy with this
young lady
paramour, it was before he was actually in the White House, wasn't it?
Well, they seem to think that your man was born. Now, get this. This is what's also weird.
Yeah.
Is that he was born on November 22nd, 1961. So, in fact, Jack Kennedy was killed in Texas on the second birthday of this infant. And I don't think there's any connection between those two. That's just sort of
it's good, though.
A little odd coincidence.
It's good, yeah. Jack Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, as we know, November the 22nd, 1963. 2 years before that, this young man was born.
Right, and he was born in November, and Jack had been inaugurated in January of '61. So, in all likelihood, it was someone he met not long after the inauguration. This little affairette was set up.
So it would have taken place when he was president, the alleged act of...
Yes, it would have.
The
and we know
act of Capitol Hill love.
Yes. Well, it might have taken place down in Texas. But of course, Jack Kennedy was no slouch. I mean, that was one of the things that was so funny during the 90s when everyone was getting their knickers in a twist about Bill Clinton and his zipper. And I kept thinking that when you read the transcripts with Bill Clinton, it was all kind of so pathetic and sleazy, whereas Jack Kennedy didn't seem to give a damn what anyone thought. I mean, he was pretty brazen.
Well, when we think back to
womanizing.
the testimony of one of the Secret Service agents, his job, this guy who became very unhappy with this job, his job was to keep a lookout for the enemies of the president.
Right.
These were people who might snitch on him because of his activities with naked young ladies in the swimming pool in the White House. Or when Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy came back from shopping, to whiz down to the swimming pool and alert the president to the fact that trouble was on the horizon. And he said this particular guy just said he couldn't handle this anymore. It was just... he felt that it was beneath a Secret Service man's dignity to be doing such a job. But I deeply suspect many Secret Service men before him did very similar jobs, and since.
I'm sure, for many different presidents.
Yeah.
As a matter of
I mean,
fact.
I think didn't FDR used to have a little thing going with that?
Yes, he had a mistress. In fact, so did Lyndon Johnson, was well known to have a mistress. But I think with Kennedy, the thing that was interesting was the volume of women.
Yeah,
Because
for a man with a bad
he had
back.
one or two. It was like every woman he met, you know. It was like, do you remember that Daniel Day-Lewis, The Unbearable Lightness of Being?
Yeah.
Where he would just meet a woman and say, take your clothes off? I think Jack Kennedy was a bit like that he just couldn't control himself.
This is the schoolboy innocence that I profess. What always amazed me about Kennedy was that he was able to do this with this an awful back. During the war he'd been injured, and of course the technology in those days to deal with the sort of surgery that would have been required to give him proper relief and full cure was just not available, and so he was constantly getting morphine injections and all sorts of different things, and he was still able to do all this work.
Well, it has been suggested, Jerry, that sometimes gentlemen who have these kind of problems or back problems or things sometimes develop more interesting skills in the boudoir. And one hears reports frequently that women say that men who are in wheelchairs or things are often surprisingly good lovers.
Because
I
of
won't go
their
into that much.
because of
they find other ways.
their
Or they
sense
get
of
more
adventure.
imaginative.
Their sense of adventure, yes, which is
They get more imaginative. They do things that maybe other men wouldn't think of doing. They spend more time on the women, trying to make them have pleasure. So who knows? I mean, Jack obviously had a way with the ladies, and they all adored him.
Absolutely.
And this particular woman, Jack Worthington's mother, adored him enough to bring the child full term.
Do we know anything about her?
No, this has still been a secret. And what's interesting is that even though the story has been breaking in the New York papers, the Canadian papers, up along the border there in Seattle, it hasn't been touched yet by anybody in Texas. Not yet, but maybe we'll see something develop that in the next week or two. Because you would think that it would be fairly easy.
The technology of DNA tracing, the Kennedys there are still living Kennedys and siblings living still. It wouldn't be beyond the bounds of scientific possibility to establish a very firm yes or no to this link. I can't imagine any Kennedy would be willing to give DNA freely, or maybe they would, John. Maybe they'd like to just get this one out of their hair, so to speak.
Well, from what I understand, the initial overtures, both by Worthington himself and by Vanity Fair, have been sort of spurned. But there are a lot of Kennedys to go around, so they might be going down a checklist till they finally find one who would be willing. But Worthington himself has said that he's not looking for any money at all, and that he's very happy to sign an agreement saying that he has no claim on the estate or any of the money.
What does he want?
Well, this is what's interesting, is that he describes himself as being a whistleblower, and he keeps suggesting that his very birth is part of a key to the whole Kennedy story. Now, I don't know if that's, just self-aggrandizement, or he's, completely overstating the importance of his existence. But he does seem to, he drew attention in a couple of the interviews. He asked, have you read Barr McClellan's book? Now, you might remember we did an item on Barr McClellan's book when it came out 4 years ago, Blood and Money and Power. And at the time, the curiosity was that Barr McClellan was the father of Scott McClellan, who was the White House spokesperson, the media person at the White House. So he seemed reasonably well connected. And he wrote this book claiming that the law firm he worked for in Texas had played a role in covering up and paying off people involved with the assassination. And he suggested that Johnson was complicitous Now, people had always suspected that Johnson knew more, but hadn't played a role in any kind of organizational thing, but that he had strong ideas of who might have been involved. But we have other testimony that's kind of interesting. Since in the last 4 years, since the time we talked about Paul McClelland's book, at which point it seemed a little crazy maybe. But a few other things have come to light. For example, E. Howard Hunt died last year, and apparently before he died, had a conversation with his son, and he wrote out a list for the son that had all the names and the connections. And the son hasn't released this list yet, but has suggested that Johnson's name did appear on the list and very high near the top of the hierarchy. So I don't know. Is he trying to suggest that this was a setup, that Johnson did want to compromise Kennedy, and that he used Worthington's mother, and that the whole thing of having the illegitimate child was a way of exerting power? And afterwards I looked back at that famous photograph of Johnson being sworn in on Air Force One. I'm sure you know the photograph.
Oh, and Jackie Kennedy's there, still in the same dress. Yeah,
she's still wearing the pink dress. Yeah. Now, could you imagine if, as a subtext, she knew that Johnson had introduced this babe and that there was an illegitimate child?
Oh.
I mean, it's a subtext I never thought of before, but that might have added to one of the reasons why the Kennedy family so hated Johnson. That they felt he was involved in something.
Let me just quote Mr. Worthington. It's simply a profound duty, I feel, to do the right thing. Many Americans won't agree and will want to sweep the dirt under the rug. Unfortunately for them, I'm constitutionally incapable of it. I'm a born whistleblower. And then if you look at Vanity Fair's research for this story, it focuses on the mother's paternal family and their history as lifelong political allies of Lyndon Johnson in South Texas. Now, I think that's beginning to give oxygen to your theory.
Well, one wonders, did he grow up in a house? Did his mother know something or suspect something? Did she tell him when he was younger and vow him to secrecy? I mean, he says, I'm a natural whistleblower, but he waited until everyone who his testimony could have been damaging to had passed away. Because at this stage, I mean, Jackie's passed away, his mother's passed away. I mean, so all those figures are no longer there. But
he has a sister, of course, still living, Caroline, if this happens to be true.
That's true.
And one wonders, would they have...
I'm sure the Kennedy family at large has reconciled themselves that given his reputation for womanizing, it's surprisingly that there aren't hundreds of them. He should have more illegitimate children than Charles II.
But it really makes you wonder about that. Either he had the most competent staff in the world who are running around firefighting, covering up and paying off in his wake, or in fact rumours of his sexual prowess were exaggerated. I mean, I suppose that's possible as well.
That is a possibility as well, but it also seems that many of the women who were involved with Jack, aside from, we had Judith Exner Campbell, who we know was a setup by the mob. She was being used by the mob to infiltrate and get dirt on Jack and use Jack.
Yeah.
But say someone like Angie Dickinson, the actress.
Did Peter Lawford introduce her to him?
That's right. And everyone kind of knows that they had a hot thing going for a couple of years. And, of course, she has been very loyal, has never spoken about it. And one feels that there were a lot of women like Mary Pinchet Myers, who was his mistress when he was in the Senate. And, of course, she was murdered in 1964. And, conspiracy enthusiasts all say that there's a connection, although there doesn't really seem to be. That actually seemed to be just a terrible thing where she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But nonetheless, we know that there are lots and lots of women, but many of them were very loyal to Jack and really were crazy about him. And
it is incredible how, Lawford claimed towards the end of his life, and he was pretty tight-lipped about most of this, and there were many who believed that in a way he had a very invidious position or role to play in Jack Kennedy's life, that he was effectively a pimp,
Yes, that he did a lot of that.
And, towards the end of his life... Towards the end of his life, he kind of got to grips with being able to say, well, some of it wasn't great, and there were a lot of people who were compromised by what happened, and there was a lot of women. Now, if there were a lot of women, I cannot believe that all of it was protected sex and all of it was done in the sanity of, family planning. I wouldn't think so. So there must There must be. Odds on there's one child out there.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that makes
so the only question,
compelling.
The only question really is this the child?
Is this the child? And hopefully, now that he has begun to speak, and has also put such weight on it, because he does suggest that, this is a clue, I'm a whistleblower, that there's something more in the background here that he knows, that this is alerting people, and we're going to see more and more investigations. But Jerry, something else interesting happened over the weekend. And this I also found hard to believe, because I was scanning through all the Texas papers to see if any of them had picked up on the lead, and I couldn't find anything. But there in the Dallas Morning News on Saturday, there was a report that they had just discovered boxes and boxes of artifacts related to the Ruby Oswald trial that had apparently been locked up in a safe on the 10th floor of the Dallas courthouse, and I guess forgotten about for 44 years, which happens all the time, right, Gerry?
God, I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff happened in Dallas that stayed in Dallas and that we may never know about. I wasn't into the conspiracies until I got older, and now the more I read about various aspects of the national security services being stood down on the day, warnings not being heeded, the ease with which some people seem to have, access to the president, there was just a lot of people either had fabulous intuition that something was going to happen or knew. Right.
Well, people did know, because apparently the idea that the mob was trying to do it was much better known among the intelligence agencies than was admitted at the time, because apparently there were similar plots afoot both in Miami and in Chicago. And in one case, this is just in the weeks before Dallas, they canceled a visit that was to Chicago because the suspicion was so strong that there was going to be an attempt, that they canceled the trip. So clearly everyone involved, at the higher levels of this president's security detail knew that there were threats.
Also, can you imagine Hoover, who was in charge of the FBI at the time, who absolutely despised the Kennedys? I now firmly believe, even if somebody'd come along with a tape recording of the mob, the Cubans, and God only knows what other disaffected exiles, and with them all saying, yeah, we're all going to kill Jack Kennedy, we're going to do it at this time in Dallas, I think Hoover would have just gone, put it in a drawer.
Hoover's response on the day has always been a curious one, because you would think the head of the FBI would immediately get, his shirt sleeves rolled up. But apparently all Hoover did was he made 2 phone calls. He called Bobby Kennedy, and who was also Attorney General at the time, so it wasn't necessarily a friendly family.
Oh, no, it was business. Yeah.
It was business. And the second call was to a fellow named Herbert Bayer, who was the chairman of Humble Oil, Texas. And, Hoover was very close with a lot of these Texas oil millionaires who were very crazy. In fact, a lot of them still are crazy, if I put it bluntly. And then after Hoover made the 2 calls, he went off to the horse races.
Yeah, that's pretty weird. On that note, I'm going to ask you to hang on. I don't know. Do you know anything about the case of the Irish psychologist hacked to death in New York?
Oh my God, what a terrible story, okay. Dr. Fahy, right?
Yeah, will you stay with us and maybe bring us up to date on that after these?
All right, because they've caught the guy,
I know, so I believe. Back in a moment.
Eric Clapton. Live at Malahide Castle, Dublin, Saturday, June 21st. Subject to license.
I did not shoot the deputy.
Tickets from $76.25 are on sale now.
Lay down, Sally. There's no need to leave so soon. And I say yes, I feel wonderful tonight.
Eric Clapton, presented by Aiken Promotions in association with RTE 2FM.
And the headline is The 17-Year Grudge. An Irish therapist was hacked to death over an alleged 17-year grudge held against a doctor that she worked with. John, they've caught the guy. Can you tell us the detail behind this one?
Well, it's a sordid kind of case. David Tarloff is this fellow's name, and he appears to be somebody who had been in a degenerating mental state for a couple of decades and was shuttled in and out of various institutions. And then about 3 months ago, he stopped apparently taking his medication, which can always be a bad thing for a lot of these people. and he had some harebrained scheme where he wanted to go and kidnap his mother out of her nursing home and take her to Hawaii. And it appears that the evidence that led to his being caught was that he had actually left a bag that he had been carrying when he arrived. He left the bag near where he exited, at a fire exit or emergency exit on the ground level. And the bag was filled, the bag not only had his fingerprints, which was what led to his arrest, but the bag was filled with adult diapers and women's clothes. This was clearly going to be the bag for his mother.
Ah, because we were wondering, was he going to wear them himself during his...
Well, but that added even a further, like, what? But I think it was that in his mind, he thought like this was going to be to take care of his mother, that he was going to go kidnap her. And the idea was that he had chosen Dr. Shinbach, who shared the offices on East 79th Street, because Shinbach had played a role in his being institutionalized back in 91. And therefore, this was a vengeance thing. He said, I'm going to go there, I'm going to rob him. And somehow we thought he was going to get enough money or cash. You know, who uses cash anymore? That he was actually going to be able to afford to kidnap his mother and go off to Hawaii and start a new life. So the whole thing was obviously the musings of somebody who was not in any way really connected to reality. And the thing is, of course, is that for years, despite the fact that he seemed to have a temper and to be fairly explosive at times, most people simply regarded him as sort of a nuisance and not really as a danger. They had become quite used to him in his neighborhood in Queens where he lived, where he would shuffle around in house slippers and, you know, his pants open and, you know, in a T-shirt and ice-cold weather, this kind of stuff.
But there was obviously seething fury building in this man.
Right, building and building and building. And when his mother was moved into a nursing home, he was then left entirely on his own. So clearly that allowed his, to spin completely out of control. Now, what's interesting is we don't fully know what the relationship with the mother was. I mean, there's even a suspicion that maybe the father had put her in a nursing home because he was worried about her safety, living with the son, and this was the only thing he felt he could do, because the son kept visiting the nursing homes, and the father kept moving her. Within the last year, she'd been moved to 3 different nursing homes because he kept finding them and threatening them.
Oh, this sounds like sleeping with the enemy.
You know? Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the death that that the Irish psychologist suffered was absolutely horrific, wasn't it? I mean, she put up one heck of a fight by all accounts.
You know, and apparently he was just completely out of control, you know, hacking away. It's really horrific because by all accounts she was an extraordinary woman. I mean, it really is. I mean, I don't know if you spent time reading over the memories and comments of people who knew her.
Yeah.
But it really breaks your heart, you know, because she apparently was exceptional.
Will he be, given the fact that he's obviously deranged, will he be charged? Is he fit to stand trial? What's the opinion on that?
Well, I suspect there is a strong case that, you know, he was mentally unstable, but he's obviously going to be locked away in a facility for the criminally insane, you know, which are, you know, I mean, at a certain point, that is almost as good as being, you know, locked up for the rest of your life in prison.
Okay, John
But he may not face a trial in the traditional sense, no.
John Farrell, thank you very much for both these stories this morning. Great to hear your voice again. We'll
Same
talk
here,
soon.
Gerry.
Okay,
Take care now. Bye-bye.
This is the Gerry Ryan Show on 2FM. Call 08457 585 285 from Northern Ireland.
My next guest was once described as the penis on legs. What other way could you have? What the penis on floats? What? And he's a man who's had a roller coaster of a career so far. After 20 years of Fleet Street, he was sacked as editor of The Mirror in 2004. This was followed by a period of soul searching, during which he described himself as a semi-retired old fart, running around Sainsbury's all day and watching DVDs, because that's what happens when you come from a huge job and you're suddenly excommunicated from a big corporation. Then, to the surprise of many, he went on to star in the #1 TV show in America. America, You've Got Talent, and we spoke to him there quite recently after the publication of his hugely successful and highly entertaining book, The Insider. Now the former tabloid bad boy is back with a new book, Don't You Know Who I Am? Inside Diaries of Fame, Power and Naked Ambition. Could it be anybody else except Piers Morgan? Good morning and welcome back.
Good morning, Gerry. Lovely to be back.
A penis on legs. Who said that?
That was Maureen Lipman. I think it was just sort of repressed sexual tension, I think. We were doing Celebrity Apprentice together, and I think she just couldn't deal with it.
just hoping that you were going to be a penis on legs. I would imagine.
I think that's what it was. It was either her or Cheryl Cole.
Yeah,
which, now we know what we know about her, would have been a better bet, I think.
Yes, Cheryl Cole, probably more interesting. Now, you certainly, I think it is fair to say that even though you seemed very upbeat the last time we spoke, and you have a fantastic sense of self-deprecation and good sense of humour, and you have to have that in your business, certainly in the newspaper business, because one day you're on, the next day you're off. It was a tricky time. Nobody, well, I don't know anybody who could have predicted that you would manage to inveigle, insinuate, you slimy bastard, yourself into one of the world's most successful television programmes. I have been doing this for a quarter of a century, Morgan, and that hasn't happened to me.
To be honest, Gerry, whenever I'm lying on my sunbed at the Beverly Wilshire in Hollywood, I do often think of you, actually, back slaving away on your show.
Thanks.
It'll happen. I'm putting a good word in everywhere I go, don't worry. No, listen, listen.
How did it happen?
Well, it was, to be honest, the two words are Simon Cowell. He'd been a friend of mine for a long time, long before he was famous. When I was a newspaper editor, I used to do a lot of stuff with Simon through his record business. And then we had lunch together about 3 years ago, and he said he was looking for a judge for a new talent show in America. And it was America's Got Talent, which is now spawned itself into Britain's Got Talent here, and in fact there are, I think, 30 countries around the world running the same show now. It's been an incredible global success. But the first one was in America, and I'd never worked there in my life, and he said he wanted a judge who was, in his words, even more obnoxious than I am, and he immediately thought of me. So I was transported to Hollywood 3 weeks later, and to my amazement, I think everybody else's, the show went to number one, and it stayed there as a summer number one show ever since, which has been, fantastic, to be honest.
Has it made an enormous difference to your financial situation?
Yes, but that's
there isn't a hint of bitterness here when I ask these questions.
Look, I think it's, to be honest, I was always quite well paid as an editor, and it was money's never been my motivating factor at all. People always find that rather unbelievable.
Difficult to believe is the phrase.
Yeah, but it's not. I think I've always earned reasonable amounts of money and had a good quality of life. But what I love about the job is that to be able to work on American television, which is one of the most competitive markets in the world, and for anyone who's worked in broadcasting in Britain, certainly I know what a holy grail the American TV world can be, and to be on a big show there is a fabulous experience. They treat you like some sort of deity when you get out there. It's all limos and wonderful suites and hotels and best tables at the restaurants and stuff, but it also has a wonderful finality and brutality to it. I talked to Anne Robinson, who was a big hit with Weakest Link there, but only for 2 years, and when the ratings began to dip, she was suddenly, bang, no one took her call, she was sent home in economy, and it was all over. I quite like the sure knowledge that even though it's all wonderful, it's all going to come to another crashing, shuddering halt.
Well, I recall, and I have to be very careful how I tell this story because we've just re-signed a contract with them and they're now our friends once again. We used to be the media partners of Walt Disney World in Florida. They're European media partners, and when we were coming to the end, because we'd had an argument with them and I said I wasn't able to do a programme with a senior executive from Disney standing on my shoulder, wondering what the editorial of the programme was going to be, because we used to say we won't say shit or bastard or Mickey's a paid fee or anything like that. Don't worry, we're not stupid. But they insisted on having somebody standing on the shoulder, and I just wouldn't have it. So we got into a bad fight with them, and at 11 o'clock, sort of 11:59, we were still covered in pixie dust. At 12:01, it was over. It was history. It was goodbye. Who are you?
Yeah,
and that's the way America does it. And now we're back on, so we're lovely again. The mouse loves us, the duck loves us, everybody loves us. We're back on again. Now, you are back on with a bang, though, because they have... And I do think maybe you underestimate the way that you've pitched your play on the show. You are completely different to Simon Cowell. Simon finds it almost impossible to appear genuine or caring. Now, I think Simon is a genius, but caring mightn't be in the lexicon there. You do a good, at least the best impression I've seen of caring, in between making people cry and fall apart. But you can suddenly become quite pleasant, and I think the Americans love that.
I think the Americans do love an underdog, and I think that sometimes my role is to be pretty blunt and frank with them, and it's a very subjective thing, a talent show. I mean, the variety aspect of the talent show that I do is that anything goes. You can be any age, you can look whatever you like, you can come on and do whatever you want, and it's very subjective. I mean, I probably know less about hoops than you do, or juggling, or fire eating, or anything else, but all you can go on in the end is the entertainment factor. But there is a second dimension, which is where this caring aspect can come in, which is where you really sense that someone is giving it their all and it really matters to them. I like that kind of person we see on the show, where they may have spent 30 years perfecting their juggling art. They may not be the best in the world, but you see in them this absolute love for what they do and a real desire to do well. And that, I think, can often lead to what Simon always calls this sort of likability factor, where the public warm to these people. We had a great one on Britain's Got Talent last year, who was a young baton twirler. Now, it's not the most obvious crowd-pleasing thing, and he certainly wasn't the best baton twirler in the world, but what he had was this amazing likability, and we moved with him, the audience came with us, and it was incredibly inspiring, sort of Billy Elliot style thing that we ended up with, which was very heartwarming, and I like that kind of story. It's very much a sort of rags to riches thing. I was weaned on films like Rocky and stuff like that, and I always liked the underdog coming to the fore and doing well. Simon, I think, likes the underdog to do well as long as he's making loads of money out of them at the end of it.
Says he can sign the underdog.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But you do pick that moment quite carefully. I mean, are you aware of that, or is it instinct?
Well, we have a big advantage. I mean, on X Factor, for example, there's no live audience for the audition, so you don't get any feedback from a wider public, whereas the advantage on the two talent shows that I do is that we have this big 1,000-strong audience. I mean, in Britain, we've just finished the auditions for the second series of the British show, and we were having audiences in places like Blackpool of 3,000-4,000 people. And they can move you. They can get behind somebody where you least expect it. They see a vulnerability. They see some nerves. Whatever it is, it can trigger audience sympathy. And that can push people a long way in these competitions. If the audience likes you and wills you to succeed, it makes them do better, because if you're in the middle of your act and suddenly the audience begin to roar, then you get a real sense of occasion, and it really can improve an act. Similarly, the audiences can be quite brutal. I mean, we went down to the Hackney Empire last week to finish things off in London, and it was utterly brutal. I mean, they were chanting off, off, off within seconds of acts appearing, like some sort of awful comedy store back in the 80s. And, again, it's very tough for them, but it makes for extremely entertaining television.
How do you feel about having children on the show? Because that is the one area where I think people really, if there's a bristle factor, that's where you're going to find it.
It's very difficult. We had lots of children in tears on the audition process this time round, because lots more children acts entered. I think because last year a young girl called Connie, who was 6, sang Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and everyone was moved by it. And she was totally fearless and never shed a tear, and I don't think would have given a damn what we said to her. But kids are very different. I've got 3 children myself, 3 young sons, and my yardstick really is if their parents are prepared to push them onto a stage in front of a panel including Simon Cowell, an audience of 1,000 people, an audience at home of millions, then that's their responsibility. And all we can then do is, I think, at least be kind and sensitive where we can, whilst at the same time being honest to the show's integrity, because there's no point just saying to every child, you're wonderful, if you think that's going to stop them crying. Kids tend to cry if they get rejected in life. I found on this show what happened when as I said, a lot of them cried on this show. Young girl dance groups in particular, where the average age is sort of 7, 8, 9. It means a lot to them, and we had millions of these acts. And when a few of them do start crying, I always stopped it and said, look, you got to stop crying. You're now in an audition process. You want to be in show business. You're going to meet much tougher critics than me, much more knowledgeable critics about dance than I am. And you've got to learn about, triumph and disaster, about success and failure. And as you explained it to them, the tears would dry up and you see a certain determination creeping in. And I'm sure that after our little speech to them like that, they would go away tougher and better for that experience. However, Having said all that, if you ask me, would I want to put one of my own kids into that environment, the answer would be no, unless they had an absolutely outstanding talent. I mean, I've got a middle son who does brilliant impressions. Would I think that he could do it on a stage in front of all those people and not get buzzed and not get perhaps humiliated? I wouldn't put him in that position. And I think parental responsibility is paramount here. And I saw too many acts, both in America last summer and in Britain this time, where I felt parental pressure was driving children who looked pretty miserable actually onto these stages, and where we saw that, we were pretty critical towards the parents.
Well, I watched it the other night. I don't know whether it was a repeat or what, but there was one parent, and she came out and this little girl was in a kind of pretty bad way. And she was there going, I think you'll find that Piers that and you're just going, oh, shut up, shoot her, shoot her. She's responsible for dysfunctionalizing the child. But then when you actually look closely, the child's actually doing okay usually, and it's the mother who should be shot.
Yeah, look, I mean, my kids will...
In fact, could you not have that as a section in it where they shoot the parents?
I occasionally would like to have a pool of sharks where you would just literally, when these parents come on, you can see the desperation.
Like Dr. Evil, Piranha.
Yeah, the pool of sharks. And if they're very annoying, pushy parents, we just simply push a button and they get removed from that poor child's life. Because a lot of the time, Simon will say to them, to the kids directly, wouldn't you, they come out and they're playing violin and they're not very good and the parents are marching along beside them singing some awful song. And Simon will say, wouldn't you rather just be having a Big Mac or playing football? And and you really feel that. You see the misery in their faces, and I hate that. And I get very protective of the children when I see that, because I see my own kids standing there in my eyes, and I think I would never want them to look so miserable or so nerve-wracked.
It's so moving, Piers. It's caring. It's so moving.
Well, you started all this caring stuff. I'm only responding to the allegation.
Now, actually, speaking of the allegation, let's think of all our pals in the Sun and the News of the World and in the Mirror. I mean, this must have been. I mean, this was like putting itchy powder in their underpants. This must have driven them mad.
Oh, I think they've been driven completely bonkers. My favourite breed of them is the TV critics, most of whom I've either fired or humiliated. So I now get the worst reviews imaginable. But what I found is that the reviews bear absolutely no relation to rating success whatsoever. In fact, the worse they get and the more abusive they are, the better I seem to do. So I'm actually quite in favour of getting tormented by critics, because it seems to drive a weird sort of sympathy vote from the public.
Did one single former colleague from any of the press experiences that you've had in the past text you or send you an email or a handwritten old-fashioned note or anything saying, well done, old buddy, glad to see him, it's gone. I've
had a surprisingly warm reaction actually from former colleagues. I mean, I had a great reaction when I left the Mirror. I had some amazing letters from some of the people at the Mirror I never expected to write to me in a million years, who I never thought cared that much for me, but really moving letters about. I mean, I think in particular what resonated with some of the older Mirror hands at the time was the campaign we waged against the Iraq War, against abuse by rogue British soldiers towards Iraqi civilians, and our position after 9/11. We won lots of awards after that. We did some amazing journalism in that time, and although I'm now enjoying all the fun world of TV and stuff, I look back very fondly and proudly on the latter years at the Mirror, where we did some powerful stuff, and it's not lost on the journalists who worked there. We really felt we were making a big difference, and I'm proud of that. And I had a great reaction from them, and now they do get in touch with me now and again, and they are genuinely pleased for me. Others, of course, want to kill me and resent it all, but that's fine. That's the way it should be.
And Piers Morgan, Don't You Know Who I Am, the #1 bestseller. Every page is gold, says Heat magazine, and he's with us in our London studio. Piers, the most asked question apparently is, what's David Hasselhoff like? Now, I have to say, I can't resist once again asking it. He always appears to be so much in control of himself on the programme. He seems to be, the audience seem to relate very well to him. And yet, when you read the book, he's a gibbering mess.
I don't think he's a gibbering mess. I mean, he's a wonderful character.
Sorry, I meant a wonderful character.
Of course he did, yeah. He's a very complicated guy. He's got a lot of issues in his life which people know about relating to alcoholism and stuff like that. I have to say though, I find him he can be utterly hilarious. He can be very self-deprecating, and then he can twist into big star syndrome, which a lot of American stars in particular can fall victim to. And underneath it is quite an insecure, quite vulnerable guy who I really do enjoy working with, and I wouldn't say that lightly. He's very entertaining. He's unpredictable, very warm, and the audience absolutely love him. He only has to come on doing that slow walk from Baywatch, and they all go completely crazy. And and it's hard to remember now, but I mean, for your younger listeners,
what a star!
Well, the Hoff was in two of the biggest shows of all time. I mean, Baywatch and Knight Rider were watched by hundreds of millions of people, and he was for about 10 years probably the biggest star on world television. So it's a classic case of a guy who was in that position and then lost most of that status, and now is back in a number one show in America and loving it, and has all his personal vulnerabilities and stuff. But essentially, a good bloke, the Hoff. I like him.
Do you reckon he's an example of it's better to get the story out, and if people, if there is a video of you pissed out of your mind eating a hamburger that your wife has put on YouTube, better get it out there and let them decide for themselves. Actually, you've talked since the publication of the book about him kind of losing it one day on set, I think, and it was probably around the time of that incident with the video, wasn't it?
Well, I remember that day very well because he told me at lunchtime that there was this video coming out. I didn't really say what it was in it, but I realised it was obviously going to be embarrassing.
Well, I would have imagined that he was lamping some young one or something, but no, it's him pissed with a hamburger.
It's almost worse. It was like him laid bare really as an alcoholic, sort of semi-naked.
That is worse, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. It was very, very humiliating for him. And he's a guy where his reputation means a lot to him, and all the work he'd done to get back to number one, and suddenly he saw it all disappearing. But even in that moment, this is what I like about him, he was able to see the absurdity of it all and the humour in it. I mean, I said to him, with about an hour to go, we were still filming auditions, and he was very distracted, as you can imagine, and knew it was about to break on one of the big TV shows. I said, what does it feel like, David, to have the knowledge that this thing's coming? And he said, you know what it reminds me of? He was chuckling. He said, in those old sort of MGM movies when they had the big gong at the start, I think it was MGM, and you'd see this big gong big stick go back to whack the gong, and then bong. And he said, I feel like the stick is above my head, and in 1 hour it's going to clash straight onto my head. And he said, that's what it's like. And then he rocked back, burst out laughing, and spent the rest of the 10 minutes chuckling away. And I thought, there's a guy who is at least able, even in that really dark moment, to see the funny side. And that's why I'll always warm to the Hoff, Well,
I mean, you're not without those experiences yourself. And when we spoke, I remember when you were being accused of insider trading, and you knew that coming down the line was a delight, and the succulent, tender beef that was to be enjoyed by your rivals was just about to be carved on the table in front of them, and you were it. I mean, you must have felt pretty much the same thing at that time.
Oh, it's horrendous. There's nothing. I mean, whether you have dished it out yourself or not, it doesn't change the impact when these things happen to you. All it means is you can't complain about it. There's no point me bleating about press intrusion or, stories that weren't quite right or being unfairly caricatured or maligned by the media. I mean, that's been my game for 20 years. And to now be on the other side of the fence for most of my career now, it's quite an interesting experience. I mean, I get stuff written about me all the time that I know is completely inaccurate, but I take a view that, I know how much journalists get lied to by PRs and agents and managers and lawyers. I know how that game works. I accept that as long as they're not really accusing you of being a paedophile, then how bad can most of this stuff really be? I mean, I find most of that old maxim, what doesn't break you makes you stronger is true to a point, but what is truer is there really is in the modern age very little about bad publicity that's going to hurt you. What you think is bad at the time makes you more interesting to the public. I mean, look at all the people like Kate Moss caught with drugs by the Mirror. You would have thought for a model,
no, she gets a contract damaging. She gets a
made
contract.
10 times as much money. Yeah, Amy Winehouse wins 5 Grammys while her private life collapses. I think that a lot of these things which in in the old days would scandalise you and make you untouchable, now just make you to the public more vulnerable, more interesting. And that's not necessarily a good thing. It's not a great thing for, my 3 young kids, for example. It's hard to explain to them.
What do they think?
It's hard to explain to kids, why drugs are a bad thing when every day they wake up and read that Amy Winehouse takes loads of drugs and then wins 5 Grammys. How do you argue, as I do to them, winners don't take drugs, when quite plainly in her case they do? All you can hope is that people like Amy Winehouse recognise, and I think she's a fabulous talent. I mean, absolutely incredible talent. One of the best musical talents this country's produced in
but a
decades.
Social inept.
Socially, just, I think going through a lot of problems.
Voice of an angel, mind of a donkey.
Yeah, well, I think connected to people with minds of a donkey. I think, to be fair to her,
that's probably,
I think she's young, impressionable. It's gone to her head a bit, and she's in trouble. However, if she was to turn it round now and make a big stand against drugs, that would be powerful. So really, the media just have to go where the story is. Amy Winehouse now saying winners don't take drugs, and I know because I'm now a winner and I don't. That would be a powerful message. More people like her need to take responsibility for their fans and for young people than I think they do. And then I think the media has to go along with that and reflect the fact that
have your kids ever said
there's no money in this kind of thing.
Have your kids ever said to you, Dad, what does that mean? Or why did you say that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, my kids...
What was the worst one they've ever asked you about?
Well, I mean, to give you the sharp end of what it's like having kids when things go badly wrong. I remember when I was fired from the Mirror, my youngest son, Bertie, was 3, and he was in a terrible state because he actually thought from the news coverage I'd been set on fire. Now, I found it funny later to talk that story about, but trying to console him...
Not funny at the time, no.
No, trying to console him, it was horrific. And then your kids go to school and you've gone from being this sort of, successful editor, and it's all quite something to be proud about, to somebody who is publicly fired and humiliated. It's tough. But I always say to them, kids, life is like that. Life is quite tough. And, I've got a big bugbear about the moving away from competition in schools, particularly in sport. When you read about egg and spoon races being banned, you think, what is going wrong with our country, where we're so PC now that we can't even allow kids to compete for egg and spoon races? I want my kids to win and lose. I go to them on sports day, and I like them to win events, or to come third, or to come last. Because whatever they do, they learn from it. They learn what they're good at. They learn what they're not so good at. They learn where to work harder. It teaches them about the reality of adult life, which is no one gives you anything for nothing, And you're going to be good at some things and bad at others. But I think we've got to get back as a country to reminding young people who've had it pretty easy. Our kids get it easy in life. I mean, I go back to my parents' generation, the post-war children. They had it tough. And my grandparents, who lived through the war, they had it even tougher. Our kids have a pretty soft ride. And I think we need to allow them to be competitive and allow them to feel that life's got a tough edge to it. I think it's better for them.
Of course, they banned football in a lot of play yards in Irish schools now, which is absolutely ridiculous.
Right, so, absolutely absurd. All to do with health and safety and human rights. It is ridiculous. If my kids play football every day for 2 years in a schoolyard and one of them breaks an arm eventually, that's what happens. That's what happens when you play sport. Things happen to you, and you got to deal with it. Life is not a soft soap.
Now, in terms of where you live now, does America become your home, or do you feel...
No, my home will always be... Well, my spiritual home will always be Ireland. That's where my father came from and was born and bred, and whenever I go back there, I feel a wonderful affinity to the Irish people. My main living place is still London, and I have a place in Sussex down on the coast, which is lovely. But I spent about 3-4 months in America now, and it's wonderful. I live in Beverly Hills, in one of the big suites of the Beverly Wilshire, where the famous Pretty Woman film was made, and my life's a bit of a fantasy out there. It's always lovely weather, and people are incredibly nice to you. I'm in a top-rated show and stuff, But like anything, Gerry, it has a downside. I don't see as much of my kids when I'm there as I'd like to. They come out and they love it, but no one. I think everyone who's been successful in America is British. Look at Hugh Laurie, for example, who is a stunning success story in America in this show called House, which I think we get here.
Oh yeah, I know. I've seen it, and I have to say once again, that was another surprise to me. But he apparently hates it.
Well, he hates it because he's away for 8-9 months. I mean, House is on all the time, so he has to do incredibly long hours. It's like working on a soap opera. Long hours away from his family for 8 months of the year. I would hate that, and I understand why he hates it. But you're caught in a terrible situation where I think in his case he's earning, I don't know, $2 million an episode, maybe more. It's fantastic money, but there's always a downside. And to all, I think part of my book that I was trying to explain to people is that for all the glamour and the wonderfulness of this kind of life and the success you have, it's very, very important to get that balance with your real life right. I still go down to my village where I was brought up. I've got a house there, and I hang out at my local pub with all the people who knew me before. They wouldn't care whether I was successful or unsuccessful as long as I get the beers in, and that's how I like it. And I see a lot of celebrities who get all this too young, and I think it goes to their head. They lose their school friends. They start hanging out with the rich jet set. They get into drugs and booze and all that kind of stuff. They end up in rehab, and they don't even know who they are anymore. And I think that's sad. And I think it's something that we're in a celebrity-obsessed world now, but it's not all it's cracked up to be. And you've got to have a real life away from that, and almost view yourself, I think, as a caricature third person. Like there's another person called Piers Morgan or Robbie Williams or whoever it is who's not a real entity. It's this public figure, and for good and bad, it's successful for you and it brings the money in and all the rest of it. But actually underpinning that, you've got to have a real human being who leads a real life with real values.
Now, I think one of the things that freaks Hugh Laurie out is that he's in a relationship, there's a woman in his life, and he's always terrified, I think, that he's going to walk into a club or a restaurant or something, and they're immediately going to presume that this is the new woman, or that he's offside. Is there a woman in your life at the moment? Oh,
there is, yeah. I've had the same girlfriend now for a couple of years, Celia, who's absolutely delightful.
Actually, it's a gorgeous photograph of her in the book.
Well, she's very gorgeous. So I subscribe to that Michael Caine quote about his wife Shakira when he said he decided the easiest way to avoid temptation was to find the most beautiful woman you could and stick with her.
And does she come over to the United States with you?
Oh yeah, she comes all the time and loves it, yeah.
And what does she think of this new Piers Morgan?
Well, the great thing is she finds it all completely ridiculous and finds my public persona, frankly, rather absurd, and revels in my discomfort from time to time, which is the way you need it, really, when you get home and the door shuts. So I think it would be awful if she fell for the whole sort of very alluring lifestyle in a way that sort of corrupted us both. The great thing is we have a laugh about it and we have fun. And when we go out there, and we went to a hotel, I tell this story in the book, went to a hotel called Shutters on the Beach in Malibu, which is a fabulous hotel. And we got upgraded to the presidential suite where the last occupier had been Bill Clinton. We looked at each other and burst out laughing. And 10 minutes later, we're having a glass of champagne in this ridiculous suite.
And did you make her?
On the beach. And well, it was. Let's just say it was a very good weekend. But it was wonderful. But we didn't take it seriously, and we realised when we went back home that was a wonderful thing to experience. But it's not the real world, and you have to keep reminding yourself of that. Otherwise, the crash when it gets taken away from you is impossible to deal with. And that's why so many celebrities, I think, end up in terrible trouble because they miss it so much.
Now, there is another woman in your life, Sharon Osbourne, and I still, she's almost as enigmatic as the Hoff, and she certainly is very theatrical. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anybody get up and leave a set as often as Sharon Osbourne does. Is that manufactured? I mean, sometimes you look as if you're about to burst out laughing when she's...
Well, Sharon's I will say she's a bit like her dog Minnie, small and extremely ferocious, and she's a little lioness. I mean, if you cross Sharon, she will come at you with fangs bared and let you have it. And she's very dramatic, very theatrical, all those things, but underneath it, she means it. And we have real humdinger of rows. Having said that, she's one of the most generous people I know. She sent me a wonderful Prada wallet for Christmas. Nobody else bothered. And she does that kind of thing quite naturally. She's very generous. She's a very kind person. She's incredibly protective of Ozzy and her kids and the family. And I love Sharon. I think she's a tenacious fighter.
Does she like you?
That's why people like her. Oh yeah, we get on great. She likes letting me have it, and she likes, in a book she gives me a good kicking. But it's all fair and love and war. We like winding each other up, but away from it, we can have dinner together and have a good laugh about it all. But when you're in that cauldron of the theatre of the audition process, and I'm criticising some act and she loves them, she will go mad, walking off, throw things at me, the coffee cups go. I mean, it's very, very entertaining for the viewer, but pretty uncomfortable to go through it when you're in my position.
Now, Jeremy Clarkson and you.
Now, why did you have to ruin a good interview, Jerry?
25th of February, Jeremy Clarkson writes in his Sun column, a simple bird flu information film on TV should do the trick. Just the facts, how it travels, how it spreads, and how we can direct it straight through Piers Morgan's letterbox. What's wrong with him?
Do you get the feeling he's not my biggest fan?
Well, I mean, I don't, because I like Clarkson, and I can't reconcile. Why doesn't he like you?
It's a bit of a long story. When I was editor of the Mirror, we got offered a few pictures of him.
Oh, that's right.
Canoodling with a woman who wasn't Mrs. Clarkson, and he took it quite badly.
But you have to take that on the chin. If somebody,
I don't think he thinks he should. I think he thinks he's immune to any scrutiny.
But particularly since he's always, saying that, well, I don't care if your leg fell off, hop. I mean, he's pretty forthright in his own kind of, descriptions of how the world should be. So,
I thought he was being ludicrous. I mean, and it ended with us clashing at the British Press Awards in 2004, where he punched me 3 times in the head.
Was it good? Did it hurt?
No, I mean, that was the most embarrassing thing. I said,
gay punching?
After the third one, I said, it's a bit like being hit by my 3-year-old, which he actually has confirmed in public since. But it was all very unedifying. It's a bit like Hugh Grant and Colin Firth in the second Bridget Jones, when they get in the fountain and go into each other like handbags at door. Very, very embarrassing.
Dreadful fighting. Yeah.
Terrible fighting. So not the kind that any honest Irishman would view as a genuine brawl. But it was all a bit embarrassing. And then since then we tried to make up, and I detail in the book how we meet at 4 a.m. after the TV awards, and Simon Cowell's there, and we crack open a bottle of wine and we share war wounds. I've still got a scar on my temple from where his ring clipped me and drew blood, and he broke his finger hitting me, which was the only sort of good thing that came out of it. But it was all a little embarrassing, and I think after that he carried on sticking it to me in print. So I just thought, well, there's no point. Let's just carry on being enemies. It's much more entertaining.
Now, Ant and Dec seem to work quite well in the UK edition of the programme. For better or for worse, they're competent and they know what they're doing, and they're little terriers, and you can't say anything bad about them because everybody absolutely loves them. What's happened to Jerry Springer? Jerry Springer, is he ill?
No, why do you say that?
Well, I mean, I'm just looking at him and I'm going, he looks like he's in a different programme.
No, I think Jerry's a great guy. I mean, he has an amazing life, Jerry Springer. He's obviously the host of America's Got Talent now.
And about 50 million other things.
He's incredibly hardworking, but amazing career. Jerry Springer, I didn't know.
But when they go to him, though, Piers, it's like he's in another room, he is. And you're just going, does he know what's going on here,
Well, I'll tell you the funny story about Jerry Springer, because I went out for dinner with him in Beverly Hills after one of the shows, and he began telling me how he'd met Muhammad Ali 3-4 months before, and that Muhammad Ali, who now can barely speak but still has his marbles, he just can't articulate himself, but most of an amazing personality, was out with his wife, and his wife stopped Jerry Springer and said, Jerry, you've got to meet Muhammad, because he watches your show every day, the Springer Show. And Jerry told me this, and I could tell he was looking at me thinking, Piers doesn't really believe this. And I certainly didn't believe a word of it. I thought this is totally implausible that Muhammad Ali watches the Springer Show every day. I couldn't get my head around this. And anyway, absolutely true story of this. We go back to our hotel. We're staying in the same one, about a 10-minute walk. And when we get to the hotel, a limousine pulls up, and out get Muhammad Ali and his wife, which is one of the most extraordinary coincidences of my life. And the first thing his wife says is, "Hey, Muhammad, it's Jerry Springer again. Hey, Jerry, he's still watching the show." At which point he turned to me, Jerry Springer, and winked. And I realised then I could always believe everything Jerry Springer told me.
It's just... I began to get confused about him when I saw him. He did some sort of bikini program for a while, which I have to say, one part of me really secretly hankered after presenting. And he looked really old and kind of, horrible, which actually I would look as well if I was presenting the program in shorts. But he did get to rub oil on women, so that looked okay. And it was when I saw him recently on your program, I was going, This is weird. He mustn't have a contract. They mustn't be able to tell him what to do. He just wanders around in a warehouse.
No, he does. He's very much his own man, Gerry. And he's incredibly popular with the audiences. They love him. He did a show out there called Dancing with the Stars, a bit like the dance show on TV here. And he was a huge hit because he couldn't dance at all, but he was dancing so that he could learn how to dance for his daughter, who's slightly handicapped, that he could dance at her wedding. And it really touched the American public. And so that's how he ended up doing America's Got Talent, because he was known then as this heroic dancer with a very warm side to him. And I really like Jerry Springer. I mean, he was mayor of Cincinnati when he was 30, I think. Before that, he worked for Bobby Kennedy in the late 60s in his campaign team. He then went to become an anchorman on a news station for 10 years and washed up really by accident doing the much more trivial Springer show, but it was so successful and has been so lucrative, he can't give it up. But he's a wonderfully entertaining guy if you go out with him. Really, I mean, he was born in I think it was Hampstead Tube Station in the war, because his parents escaped the Nazis, came over to Britain, and he was born in, I think it was Hampstead Tube Station in 1944. So he's had an extraordinary life.
So what is he really, sort of Jerry Springsteen or something?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Now, look, I'm reading Alistair Campbell's. I have to say, despite what everybody says, I'm not getting through it as quickly as I was told I was going to get through it. Alistair Campbell's the Blair Diaries. And of course, you come to mind whenever I read them, because I'm going, oh yeah, well, Piers had a pretty bizarre relationship with Tony Blair, and more to the point, Sherry. And I suppose what I think really is, I wonder, does Piers miss those lunches, miss those meetings, miss the cut and thrust of, Well,
I've actually, it's funny you should say that, because I've been to number 10 3 times in the last week.
You're joking.
So it's quite a good time to ask me. No, I've been to see Gordon Brown twice for private little tete-a-tetes, and I went to a party there on Valentine's night where it was a great moment. Gordon Brown walked in for a charity called Piggy Bank, which is Sarah Brown's charity that she favours. And he walked in, Gordon Brown, at the precise moment I had my arms around Joanna Lumley and Nigella Lawson. I couldn't think what to say other than Happy Valentine's Day, Prime Minister. So I still go back, and I went to Chequers last month, and I get on very well with the Browns, and I don't think I'm a lot of use to them. I just tell it.
Can I ask you? Can we delve into this and ask you what the Prime Minister's been asking you about?
Not really.
Not the Hoff, surely.
No, we do talk about the Hoff.
Did he? Good.
We actually talked a lot about. I've been doing a show called Celebrity Apprentice in America, where we're getting to the final stages now. I was described last week as the most evil Brit since Oliver Cromwell, which I was quite proud of, actually. But I did ask for prime ministerial assistance in maybe facilitating me winning this, by putting a call in to Bush or whoever he felt might be able to help. But I don't think I should hold my breath.
How do you think he's doing, Piers?
I think he's finding it challenging. I think Gordon Brown has spent his life waiting for this job, and it's like one of those jobs where sometimes you wish for something so much you get it, and then you wish you never had it. I don't think he's quite at that stage. I think he finds it challenging, but I think that like any prime minister, you suddenly get hit by a series of events. I think it was Jim Callaghan who described it as being like in a choppy ocean. And when you're first in it, you get hit by wave after wave after wave, and you find it almost impossible to deal with this. And then after a time, you realise that this is how it's always going to be. You start to ride the waves. You settle into the role. And it's very different being Prime Minister to being, say, the Chancellor of Exchequer. But I've always had a lot of admiration for Brown. I think he's, underneath all the politics, a very decent man. I think he's been through a hell of a lot in his private life recently, with the death of his daughter, and then their youngest son was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. It's been very, very tough for him, I think, away from politics. But to be able to go through that and run the country and deal with a few crises and come out of it in the way, I saw him the other morning. He looked up and pumping, raring to go, ready for the challenge, and I think prepared now to really work hard to try and persuade the British public that he is electable, which is, of course, he's not been today. He's not been elected by anybody. So I think that when that happens, he will feel he's got a proper mandate.
Is he asking you to be on the election campaign team?
No. As I said to him, you couldn't afford me anyway.
That is the truth. Now, listen, are you still writing headlines occasionally in your head? Because I want you to try and consider this one finally. Okay. Princess Anne is coming as a member, as she's entitled to, as a member of the Scottish Rugby Federation and the Scottish Rugby Union, to Croke Park, the home of Gaelic games in Ireland, to watch Ireland play Scotland at the weekend. This will be the first British royal to step on onto this hallowed turf since the British Army mowed down a selection of Irish people many years ago during the less happy times. What should be the headline?
What about Old Croak comes to Ireland?
Good morning.
You see, you never lose it.
No, you never lose it. Good morning.